All right, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking into some Algebra 2 questions, specifically about factoring and different types of questions. So let's see what we can get done. If you have any questions, remember always to post them in the comment section, and I'll get back to them as soon as possible. All right, so let's see the first question, what we can do. So let's say you're given a question that says 16x cubed minus 24x squared, right? The goal is to factor this. So the first thing you want to do when factoring is to identify your greatest common factor for both terms. So in this situation, you want to look at the number and you want to look at the variables, right? So the numbers that we have are 16 and 24, and the variables that we have are x cubed and x squared. Okay, so let's look into the 16 and the 24. What is the greatest common factor? Meaning, what's the highest or largest number that can divide both 16 and 24 without leaving a remainder? Well, that number happens to be 8. 8 divides 16 two times, and 8 divides 24 three times. There isn't a bigger number that divides both of these two numbers without leaving a remainder. Now, are there smaller numbers? Yes, but the goal with factoring is to find the greatest common factor, the largest number first. So that number 8 comes on the outside. All right, now let's focus on the variables. So the trick with variables, if you see common variables on both sets, so in this situation you have an x cubed and an x squared, you always want to factor out the smallest exponent. So if in this situation there is an x cubed and an x squared, the greatest common factor between x cubed and x squared is x squared. So that comes out. So now that we know what our greatest common factor is, we can easily factor the question. So let me actually rearrange this so you guys can see it pretty cleanly. Let me do this. So we have 8x squared here, put a parentheses. Okay, so the next step is to say to yourself, what times or what multiplies 8x squared that will then give you 16x cubed? Well, I know 8 times what gives me 16? Well, 8 times 2 gives me 16, so I put a 2 there. And x squared times what gives me x cubed? Oh, well, that's an x, right? An x squared times an x equals an x cubed. Okay, great. So we know that the first factored form is 2x. The next thing is to ask yourself, 8 times what gives you negative 24? Well, we know that 8 times 3, as we said before, is 24. Therefore, accounting for signs, a minus 3 times an 8 gives you the negative 24. And then x squared times what gives you an x squared? Well, it's an x squared times 1, so we won't need to write the 1 because it's implied that 1 times itself or any other number is the number itself. So there we go. Our two factored terms are 8x squared and 2x minus 3, and that would be your final answer for that question. Let's try another problem. Let's say we had something a little bit more involved. So let's look at number 2. Okay, so now we have 3 terms essentially. So the process is the same. You want to identify all the variables and all the numbers. So I see there's a 6, an 8, and a 4. So I asked myself, what's the greatest common factor for 6, 8, and 4? Well, what number divides 6, 8, and 4 without leaving a remainder? What's the largest number? Well, that happens to be 2. Therefore, 2 comes on the outside. All right, now I see the variables. We have an a. Well, there's an a in the first set, a to the first power, a to the second power. Well, both are a to the first power, my bad. And then the last one is a to the second power. So remember, like we said before in question 1, you want to factor out the smallest exponent. So that would just be a to the first power, or just a. Remember, anything to the first power is the number itself. So I don't need to put the 1 here. It just implies that there's a 1 there. Okay, next is the b. So for the b, what's the smallest exponent? It happens to also be b to the first power. Why? Because I see there's a b squared, there's a b, and another b squared. So the smallest b I have is just the b by itself. So now that I have my GCF, my greatest common factor, I can now multiply, or I can now figure out what multiplies my GCF to give me back my original equation or question. So 2ab times what gives me 6ab squared? Well, 2 times 3, I know 2 times 3 is 6, so I'll write my 3 down. A times what gives me a? Well, a times 1, so I don't need to rewrite 1. I'll just leave it blank because it's implied. And b times what gives me b squared? Well, b times itself is b squared, so I'll put down a b. Perfect. The next set. 2 times what gives me 8? Well, that's 4. And a times what gives me a? Well, that's 1. And b times what gives me b? Well, that's 1, so I don't need to rewrite those terms. And then lastly, I see there's a minus, so I'm going to put a negative here. 2 times what gives me 4? Well, that's 2. A times what gives me a squared? That's a. And b times what gives me b squared? That's b. So my final answer would be 2ab in parentheses 3b plus 4 minus 2ab. Now, a good thing to check, which I should have mentioned in question 1, if you ever want to check to see you factored correctly, a good fail-safe if you're in a test and you have time, if you multiply these two terms and distribute them, then you should get back your original question. So that's just a quick check, right? And you can see here, let's use question 1 for example. 8 times 2 is 16. X squared times x is x cubed. And 8x squared times negative 3 is negative 24x squared. Right back to where we started, which shows that we factored correctly. Okay? Okay, we can do one more problem from the factoring. Let's see. How about this? Okay, so looks a little bit different, concept's the same. You ask yourself, is there a number that divides both 6 and 5 without leaving a remainder? The highest number would be 1. So between 6 and 5, the greatest common factor is 1. So we don't need to put 1 down because it's implied. Okay. The next, is there an A that's also beside the 5? No. So that's not in common between these two terms here, right? Okay. So that's good. But I do see that they share an A plus 3B in common. Therefore, that is the factor, the greatest common factor for both. So that comes out like that. And then we ask ourselves, A plus 3B times what gives you this entire term here? Well, we already have the A plus 3B, so the only thing that we're missing is the 6A. So we put the 6A down, and then same thing. A plus 3B times what gives me negative 5 parentheses A plus 3B? Well, that's just missing a negative 5. Therefore, our factored term would be A plus 3B times 6A minus 5. And that would be your final answer. All right? Well, hopefully that was some good insight on factoring three different types of situations. Take a look at it, try to do these questions on your own, which is always helpful. And if you have any questions, just drop it in the comments. See you guys next time.